Yeah, so Passive House Trends in Australia 2021. Passivhaus. I don't really care whether you say tomato or tomato. Let's not call the whole thing off. The most important thing is that no matter how we say it or spell it, is that we understand it and use it, especially where it's most appropriate. And there's a little bit of a kickback against it. As Neil deGrasse Tyson, that astrophysicist, says, your inability to grasp science is not a valid argument against it. So suffice to say, just very quickly, to fend off the sort of the usual questions and get into the meat of it, if there are questions around why would I bother with Passive House in Australia, ask clients what their real comfort zone is, and everybody's is slightly different. Calculate the actual heating and cooling hours for the site outside of their comfort zone using a tool that measures it properly. And that is the actual heating and cooling energy that your clients are likely to use. So then ask how they handle bushfire smoke. Can they keep it out of their home? Or do they want to keep it out of their home? How do they maintain fresh air? Do they have any idea how much CO2 builds up in bedrooms at night, especially with smaller bedrooms and children? And all of these things really point you towards why would you bother with Passive House. So you get control of thermal comfort with very low energy input. You can choose when to close up and when to throw it all open, so there's no need to live in an esky all day, every day. Fresh air, with regard to low CO2, is guaranteed when it's closed up, thanks to the heat recovery ventilation. And it can filter up to, depending on which filtration system you use, which cartridge, up to 97% of smoke particulates, and that's been shown in the last summer, the black summer, from a house in Canberra that was monitored for particulates. So that equals healthy and sustainable, and actually healthy is sustainable, because if it's not healthy, it's not sustainable. So where is Passive House going in this dreamy land of Oz? It's already gone where certain people in the federal government fear to tread, and that's net zero. So I'm going to look at 4 things, and some of them are going to have to be very brief in 15 minutes. Consumer interest and cost barriers. Secondly, design and detailing methodology, what's involved with certification and the QA and value proposition. Thirdly, common construction techniques and where that's going. And fourthly, coping with the changed climate, especially with regard to prolonged heat. So ripping into it. Number 1, consumer interest increasing, cost barriers falling away. What we've found is that it costs between 3 and 5% more to build Passive House than a classic passive solar. Now that's going to vary around the country, and it is based on using a builder who is familiar with Passive House and understands what's required and does not just charge a great big fear factor, fear of the unknown. In terms of the things that attract: great comfort, no condensation or mold, and better CO2 health. Compared to the typical project home, which we've found in our experience of consulting to a lot of people on their project home builds, they end up costing at least 2,500 a square metre and up to 3,500 a square metre. So there's a bit of a price difference, but they will depreciate to zero in 25 to 30 years. And that's easily verified by looking at a block of land that is vacant in the same sort of street in the same suburb as a house with a 30-year-old project home on it, and they're about the same price. So the project home hasn't reached the end of its practical life, it's reached the end of its capital value life. Now, even with basics compliance, that sort of building still has high running costs, low to moderate comfort, and certainly no condensation or CO2 health certainty. So if you swap out a bit of size, the second media room, for quality and performance, then you get a better result, which consumers are increasingly waking up to. Second point, design and detailing methodology. It certainly helps to keep Passive House in mind from the first sketch stage. Cubic buildings work better, yes, that's simple building physics, but articulation is okay if it's not out of control. Now that's true in most climates. Alpine climates, you probably still end up pretty much with a cube, and that's logical when you think about it. Think about thermal bridges in the structure when you're developing the design. Use a Flixo tool, which is shown there on the right. Timber is certainly easier than steel and concrete, but these two materials can be insulated effectively. And we use a lot of slab on ground and sometimes with large steel beams to get over big spans and bracing needs. But for instance, with the slab on ground, we use the Ice Edge 2 detail, which we've published for general use with no constraints on its use or reproduction. Passivhaus certification. Look, it's the same the world over. Basically, the PHI, the Passivhaus Institute, you need a certifier, the PHI certifier, and they have a third-party process, and you submit everything to them. They go through it with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that it complies. And then the third point on this section is about quality assurance and value. The big thing is that it requires everyone on site to keep their eyes on the ball. And that creates a magnificent overall uplift in quality assurance. And then you also have 2 blower door tests, one at lock-up and one at completion, and that is a proxy. It's a test to make sure that everybody has kept their eyes on the ball. And that's the single biggest benefit in terms of longevity of the building, is that you know it's been built well. With regard to common construction techniques, I'm going to run this little movie. This is a house that recently completed in Asquith, just received its certification. Generally, we're going for lightweight timber frame, either on slab on ground or timber floor. Why? Because it's easy to insulate, you get few thermal bridges, but you still need the slab edge insulation. It's very fast to erect. The movie here is showing 2.5 days of work on site. We use an off-site flat pack modular construction from a company in Melbourne, Carbon Light. And basically it comes to site, and this one came to site on 2 semi-trailers, and you can see the speed with which it's going together on site. That reduces labour costs for the builder. The builder loves it because they can actually achieve more projects in a year, and with reduced on-site labour costs. But it still gives you heaps of choice and variety in terms of the shape of the building, the overall aesthetic of the building, the external materials. So, you know, Colorbond, WeatherTex, coincidentally, they happen to be our probably 2 most common go-tos for external finishes. And what happens in this situation, using the offsite flat pack modular, each panel comes with an airtight membrane on one side and a vapor permeable membrane on the other, and insulation in the middle, and the structure integrated into it. And at the completion of this 2.5 day project, it is ready for the installation of windows and doors and the first blower door test. That's even before the roof's on and the cladding's on. That kind of all happens in addition to. So, and you can see the roof there with its double battening, the longitudinal battens to provide the drainage pathway, and the roofing just goes straight on there. No need for an anti-con blanket. You can have an anti-con blanket if you want the extra acoustic deadening, but we found that it just isn't needed. That the Colorbond roof will go straight onto that, and the condensation will form underneath it. Yep. And when it does, it just drips into that cavity and runs straight down into the gutters. So number 4, coping with the changed climate. Not climate change, not some future thing. This is with us. The CSIRO, and I realise on my screen at least that my little Zoom screen blocks out some of that text, but NatHERS star ratings basically still delivers houses that overheat according to CSIRO research, and it's certainly true in terms of all the anecdotal evidence that we've gathered. So basically, looking back, where did it come from and why? It started in Europe in 1991, and a lot of people see it as only for cold climates, and the kickback that's happened in Australia is that we don't need it. But heat flows both ways, in and out of buildings, and basic physics applies to hot climates too. So that's the key thing that we've learned in terms of how things work in Australia, that we've had to adapt certain details and change certain design strategies to cope with the longer, hotter summers. But hello, Europe's fairly quickly catching up to us in terms of the hot summers. And this summer has been no exception, a shocking summer with lots of fires and deaths from heat waves. But always remember that the occupants can choose to run the building as however they see fit. They can open the doors and throw it open plan living, do what you like. Hopefully they'll understand when it's good to do that and when it's not. And when it's closed, it really is closed. So it's not leaky. It has to achieve the 0.6 air changes per hour at 50 pascals of pressure. And at the same time, it's giving you controlled, guaranteed, filtered fresh air, not left to some chance leakiness in terms of the construction, which is just a crappy way to build. So in the winter scenario, Passivhaus traps the internal heat, just people living in it. You throw off heat, I'm throwing off heat just sitting here. And so are you. Cooking, lighting, everything throws off a bit of heat. It traps that because of the air tightness and the high insulation values, especially on the glazing. And then if you throw in a bit of solar heat gain, that's great. You don't have to, it isn't essential. So it's really useful in sites that don't get any use for solar gain. You use the HRV to provide filtered fresh air and you achieve comfort on zero energy. A little bit of a PV system on top to run the operational energy. Okay, that's kind of, where it's come from. Everybody pretty much understands that. Summer, this is where we have adapted things slightly. So Passivhaus still recognises that internal heat is still being generated. The lights are still running at night. You're still in there as people. TV's running. You still cook, perhaps less, but people still cook. If the air temperature is too hot outside, if it's 30, 35, 40, 45 degrees, where can it dump that air into? The HRV's running, bringing in fresh air, but it's bringing it in at the external ambient air temperature. Now, if you have a lot of thermal mass in your Passivhaus, that can work for a day or two or three. 2-week heat wave, it will be overcome as well. And this is exactly the same problem for classic passive solar design. So our design response, our strategy here is to always include ceiling fans plus a very small air conditioning unit, typically 2.5 kilowatts with a split 2 head. Now, sometimes that's smaller than the smallest unit available, depending on the brand. Most brands sort of go down to about 3.5 kilowatts. And that's okay. It just means it's never going to be running at peak efficiency. Ceiling fans always, and make the ceiling fans and air conditioning work together so that the ceiling fans have to run before the aircon is turned on. This is all about perceived comfort. Moving air over moist skin gives perceived comfort, and ceiling fans do that on very, very low energy. So always get the ceiling fans running first, and if you hook them up together so the aircon is slave to the ceiling fans, then it makes it idiot-proof. So with the HRV, you get comfort on very zero energy from a very small PV system. So key learnings. I love that word, learnings, things we learned. That's jargon for things we figured out. It is very easy in Australia for Passivhaus to overheat. Lovely in winter, not so lovely in summer. So shading is critical. You've got to keep the solar gain out of the building. It's passive design 101, no matter whether it's passive solar or Passivhaus. Shading is critical. Always wear the big hat. Air conditioning is more or less unavoidable. In some alpine, subalpine climate zones, it might be avoidable, but we're finding that for the most part, we really need that small system, and it's run by the solar power, so we're still talking zero net energy. Ceiling fans are always great because they just give you that sense of fresh air movement and that little bit of breeze going on. Air conditioning should always be slave to the ceiling fans for idiot-proofness, and that's quite easy to do. So, quick change of colour from black to white. What's next? Well, we're waiting for an affordable integrated air conditioning HRV unit. It's logical at a conceptual level. You kind of go, hey, why can't we integrate these two things? It's they're both an appliance dealing with air handling. It makes a lot of sense. We agree with that. But at the moment, there's only one system in its kind of early commercial stages, and it's still way more expensive than just doing it as two separate units. So hopefully that will change. We're waiting. Hempcrete, wonderful building material, has got so many fantastic advantages in terms of embodied carbon and its ability to sequester carbon and its ability to deal with internal humidity and air quality. It doesn't have a great kind of proven track record in terms of Passivhaus. We've worked out some details, and the first of our hempcrete passive house buildings is starting construction very soon. So happy to report back on that at some point in the future. Flat pack constructors of the panelised system, that's just got so many advantages to builders. We just need more of those constructors around the country, or more construction plants around the country. There's certainly increasing consumer interest, and I would say that of the new inquiries we get at Envirotecture, at least half of them want to think about passive house or consider, or just want to go down that route regardless. And that's a dramatic change over even 2 years ago, and certainly from 5 years ago as a zero starting base. And then lastly, in increasing government interest and recognition, Basics has incorporated the Passive House Planning Package, PHPP, the simulation tool, into its thermal performance pathway. That's great. The NCC has not as yet. That needs to happen around the country. But we also need things like, today, BlueScope announced they're going carbon neutral by 2050. How is it that an energy intensive producer like a steel company can already have their pathway mapped out in broad terms for carbon neutrality, but our illustrious leaders, at least at the federal level, much less so than the state level, our illustrious leaders in Canberra are still stuffing around and just, coming up with merely weasel words that mean nothing and not embracing it. So between things like, leaders like BlueScope, leaders like Passive House, we can get on with it and not wait for government, and just simply show it how it can be done. And that is 100% done. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for that, Dick. We've got a couple of things there where people are saying it's a great presentation. I think that you might have stumped a few people there, giving them so much information they can't think of anything to ask you. So a great, I guess, ambassador for the association in the sustainability sector for many, many years, Dick. So we do really appreciate all your efforts that you've done for the BDAA and for the members and the profession. So there's a lot of thank yous coming in, Dick. Excellent, Dick. Great topic, Dick. There's a lot of Dicks. I'm sorry. There's a lot of compliments to you, Dick. Sorry. Here we go. Oh God, they're going so quick they can't.
Do we have time for a Q&A, Chris, or is it 15?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm just waiting to see if anyone's on. So we've got, what is the cost of a carbon light home compared to a hemp home?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good question. Certainly less. Hempcrete in situ is not a cheap way to build. It's a beautiful way to build, but it's not cheap. It is fairly labour intensive. The panelised system, such as from Carbon Light, is extremely fast. It's not, sort of bottom of the pile cost by any means, because it's still a very high performance, high quality end result. But as a percentage, or dollars per square metre, look, we don't have enough runs on the board for me to give you an authoritative answer to that yet. All of our hemp homes are so different. It's difficult to even come up with a dollars per square metre average on hemp builds, because some are quite small and intricate, and some are quite large and sprawling. So yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have a good answer for that.
Okay, there's a quick one here in relation to where is it? What are the details required specifically for hempcrete, from Alan Smith?
Big Al. So it's all about the sealing and air tightness. The interesting thing, and which our blower door test will prove when it gets to that point, is what the air tightness on the overall wall construction is, because it doesn't take, especially on a larger building, it doesn't take a great deal of air permeability for the building to fail the 0.6 air changes per hour at 50 pascals. A really leaky building won't even get to 50 pascals, which would be your average kind of project home. So So we're reasonably confident that with a rendered external skin and either a render internal or this final clear sealer that we would put on off form hemp, that the wall itself will be airtight. The interesting bit will be at the floor junction, but more critically even at the wall roof junction. And that's where we've put a fair bit of time trying to work out how to make that work. And at the moment, we're taking our wrap, our airtight wrap, in that case, under the roof structure, whereas, say in the carbon light example, it's on the outside of the structure and the permeable membrane's on the inside. And you can go either way, you know, the wall has to be able to breathe one way. Doesn't matter which. So we're bringing it on the inside and trying to work out how we get that kind of sealed off to the top of the hempcrete, because the hempcrete in traditional construction, the top of it is always a little bit rough because that's the bit that nobody sees at the top of the formwork. Now, that's in situ. Blockwork hempcrete construction, which is becoming more prevalent in WA where there's a producer of blocks, you necessarily render both sides because they're not pretty. And as soon as you've rendered the inside, you've got an easy pathway to making it sealed. So we're not worried about the block version of the world. It's just the in situ ones a little bit, you know, when you're going off form.
Dick, another question that's come in is, have you tried designing passive house using CLT?
Oh yeah, actually, yeah. So we did one on Kangaroo Island. Actually, it was one of the photos back in the slide presentation there. In fact, there are two photos of that house. Yeah, we used CLT, and it lends itself to passive house because your overall wall panels are inherently airtight. And so all you've got to do is apply sealant to the junctions where it all comes together, and that is pretty easy. And then generally you're allowing the building to breathe on the inside. So once again, you'd put a weather-tight membrane on the outside, and it breathes inside with the HRV running it. And I've stayed in that place on Kangaroo Island twice now, both in fairly warm weather, and it works really well.
Another quick question, any tips for new passive house designers in Queensland?
Yeah, be prepared for a lot of opposition. There's a strong base of, we don't need passive house in Australia, it's all wrong, in Queensland, southeastern Queensland. And look, certainly if you were doing a job on Magnetic Island or, you know, even perhaps, you know, one of the other islands where they're surrounded by sea with its massive thermal mass and never gets below a certain air temperature, it's probably overkill. But if it was in Ipswich or, you know, in behind Rockhampton or the Atherton Tablelands, hello, it gets bloody hot, and they do get winters, especially in the Tablelands and the higher country, it gets very, very cold. Now, it gets, you know, you get frosts and sleet on the Atherton Tablelands just behind Cairns. So anywhere that requires sheltering from prolonged heat or cold, it's worth looking at passive house.
Great. Dick, there's another question. Basically regarding the air conditioning in the home that you had, how do you overcome the unpleasantness of air blowing around, noise and drying?
Oh, okay. So what we tend to do is locate well, for starters, you select a system with a very low decibel rating, and they tend to be the higher quality units like Mitsubishi or Mitsubishi Heavy Industries or Toshiba or Daikin. You know, all the ones with the really high star ratings tend to be the ones with the low decibel ratings as well. And then they need to be located in a place where the HRV can basically distribute their cool or warm, you know, if needed, but essentially their cool air and dried air, because it's also, you know, they also take the humidity out effectively. So they don't necessarily have to go into the living area per se, for instance. They might be in a hallway where there's an intake for the HRV. But the thing is that the ceiling fans, wherever they are, wherever the head units are located, the ceiling fans will then take that air and move it with low velocity but high volume. And that's the key difference, that that when you're dealing with aircon, whether it's ducted or split system, if that's all you have, they have to run flat out with high fan speed to deliver the air as best they can, and it is never effective, truly. So that's one of the reasons why ceiling fans should be mandated. If I was dictator instead of Dick Clarke, I would mandate ceiling fans with aircon in every building, because the ceiling fans do so much of a better job at distributing that cooler, dried air and moving it over skin with low velocity but high volume. And that's the key.